Welcome back, Phil 301, Dr. K here. I hope you all are doing well. In our last video, we looked at Maimonides' argument from necessity against the Aristotelian position on the problem of the origin of the world. In this video, we're going to look at Maimonides' argument for the Jewish position. And as I mentioned last time, the argument that he gives for the Jewish position, we can look at it at one and the same time as a direct argument for the Jewish position and an attack on the alternative positions, namely the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Epicurean positions. First, let's refresh ourselves on what the Jewish position actually holds. Okay, so remember that the problem of the origin of the world essentially consists in two questions. Number one, did the world have a beginning? And number two, if it did, what was that beginning? How exactly did it come to be? According to the Jewish position, the world did have a beginning, and the way it came to be is that God created it, and he created it out of nothing at all. So there was God and there was nothing else. And out of nothing at all, God creates the world, he brings it into being. There's not pre-existent matter that coexisted with God and out of which he fashioned the world, as on the Platonic position. He also didn't create the world out of himself, as if he existed as a body and then he took those parts of himself and fashioned the natural world that we see around us out of his body. Remember, Maimonides thinks that God is non-physical or non-bodily. On the Jewish position, God creates the world and he creates it out of nothing at all. Having refreshed ourselves on what the Jewish position holds, now let's look at Maimonides' argument for the Jewish position. All right, so I call this Maimonides' non-demonstrative or practical argument for the Jewish position. I think also throughout these videos, I've referred to it as a speculative argument. The reason I refer to it in these ways is that Maimonides doesn't take this to be a demonstration of the Jewish position. He doesn't take it to be a proof of the Jewish position. He doesn't think that the matter is fully settled on the basis of this argument. As you'll see when we read through it, he thinks that none of the positions have been conclusively established. And what he's going to do in this argument is give us a means to select or adopt a position when the proof to establish them is not available. So again, this is going to be his argument for the Jewish position, but it's not one that he takes to be a rock-solid demonstration. So let's have a read through the argument. So premise one, none of the positions on the table or under consideration have been conclusively established or demonstrated. So neither the Epicurean, the Aristotelian, the Platonic, or the Jewish positions have been conclusively established or demonstrated. Two, the Jewish position is consistent with Scripture, but the non-Jewish positions are not. So the Epicurean position is not consistent with Scripture because on the Epicurean position, God has no part in the creation of the world. Whereas in Scripture, there is a God and God created the world. On the Aristotelian position, God does create or generate the world, but the world has always been since God has always been and God has always created it. Whereas Scripture, read literally, seems to suggest that the world has not always existed. Just consider, for example, the first passage in Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Again, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So notice the key words there. In the beginning, there was a beginning, contrary to what the Aristotelian position holds. The Platonic position, which you remember holds that God created the world out of matter that was co-eternal with him. That's to say, matter that he had not created, but that had always existed like he had existed. It's inconsistent with Scripture because there's no mention of such matter that's co-eternal with God in the creation story in Genesis. Right? So let's read a little further into the opening passages of Genesis. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Notice that there's no mention there of matter that is co-eternal with God and of God taking that matter and fashioning the world out of it, as the Platonic view suggests. Notice, however, the Jewish position, which holds that the world had a beginning and God created it out of nothing, is consistent with that opening passage of Genesis. There's nothing in that passage that is incompatible with the Jewish position. Now, of course, if we're talking about compatibility or consistency with Scripture with respect to the positions on the problem of the origin of the world, for a full examination, we would need to look at more passages than just the Genesis passage. But the Genesis passage is a central one, and it does seem to be the case that the Jewish position is most compatible with that central passage out of the four positions on the table. All right, to recap where we are in the argument so far, premise one stated that none of the positions on the table have been conclusively established or demonstrated. Premise two states that the Jewish position is consistent with Scripture, but the non-Jewish positions are not. Now let's talk about three. So premise three, in matters where none of the competing positions have been demonstrated, but one position is compatible with a literal interpretation of Scripture and others are not, the compatible position should be adopted and the non-compatible ones should be rejected. So again, his general idea here is that where there's matters of disagreement and none of the positions have been, or possibly even can't be, conclusively proved, then the way you decide to pick which position to adopt or adhere to is on the basis of consistency with Scripture. If one of those positions is consistent with Scripture, but others are not, then you should adopt the one that is consistent with Scripture. Thus, as Maimonides concludes in 4, as of now, that's to say, as of when Maimonides was writing, with the scientific evidence that he had available, the Jewish position is the one that should be adopted, and the other positions, that's to say the Platonic, Aristotelian, and the Epicurean positions, should be rejected. Right, so there we have it. Maimonides' non-demonstrative or practical or speculative argument for the Jewish position. Doesn't take it to be a conclusive proof. He doesn't think any of the positions have been proven. So then, if you want to restrict the set of positions you're considering to this set, how do you choose between them? Well, Maimonides, being a Jewish person and a proponent of the Jewish Bible, is going to say one way you could choose between them is which of the following is consistent with Scripture, most compatible with Scripture. He thinks the Jewish position is, and hence you should adopt that. And then on the basis of the seeming incompatibility with Scripture of the other positions, they should be rejected. Right, so at one and the same time, we can look at Maimonides' argument or case for the Jewish position as being an argument directly for the Jewish position. It's the one that's most consistent with Scripture, therefore we should adopt it. And also as an argument against the competing positions, these positions on the face of it at least seem to be incompatible with Scripture and so should be rejected. All right, so I want to say one more thing about Maimonides' argument here and Maimonides' kind of disposition with respect to the debate. Maimonides is a philosopher or scientist, and in the past, there wasn't much distinction between the two. He is going to be a thinker that is driven by evidence. So though he's endorsing and advocating for the Jewish position on the basis of scriptural compatibility, if it was the case that there was some new argument or demonstration that conclusively established say the Aristotelian position, it was a knockdown proof for it, right? Some new evidence was found or an argument constructed that was a conclusive proof for it. Maimonides would adopt that position. Would he then say that scripture was false? No. He would say, given that the Aristotelian position is correct, in Genesis, for example, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, etc., that there should be a metaphorical reading of that passage. So he is not dogmatic or set to a literal interpretation of scripture. He's going to follow where the evidence leaves. And if there's a demonstration for another position which seems to be inconsistent with a literal interpretation of scripture, he is going to be a proponent of that alternate position and then not suggest that scripture is false, but suggest that that passage should not be read literally, but should be read metaphorically as denoting something else. All right, guys, look, so as usual, there's so much more to say about Maimonides and on this topic in particular. And if you have anything more to say or more to add to the debate, then I'd love to hear it. But as of now, this concludes our discussion of Maimonides' discussion of the problem of the origin of the world. And it also is time for us to close the book on Maimonides and to turn to the next philosopher that we're going to discuss in the course, Al-Ghazali, or simply Ghazali, and his famous work on knowing yourself and God. So I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.